Hey, this evening, as we continue our study through 2 Corinthians, we left off in chapter 7, verse 13, where Paul is writing about his comfort that was brought to him because of the news he had heard about the repentance and the change that had happened in that church in Corinth. So he says, because of this, and it's because of the news that they had repented and had turned from their ways and had become the church that God would want them to be and the church that Christ had designated them to be. He says, we've been comforted, and besides our comfort, we've rejoiced, even much more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit also has been refreshed by you all. And if you remember, the Corinthians brought joy to Titus because Paul had been talking about how this church had changed. And Titus went to see how they were doing, and it brought great joy to Titus to see this church being so active and being so determined to stand on the truth and not allow sin in the church. And it's done a complete 180 since Paul's first letter to the Corinth. And that's why Paul says here, he says, "For I have boasted to him about you regarding anything, I was not put to shame, but as we spoke all things to you in truth, so also our boasting before Titus proved to be the truth." What do you think Paul was boasting to Titus about? He said, "I boasted to him about you, and I'm thankful that I wasn't put to the shame." He's saying Titus actually proved my boasting to be true. What do you think that Paul was boasting to Titus about? I kind of mentioned it earlier. Yeah, the church had done a 180. He was excited about what was going on in the church, and he had bragged to Titus and said, "This church it's on fire. It's a totally different church than whenever I wrote that first letter to him." In essence, knowing the rebellious history of the church in Corinth, do you think Titus was concerned about going there? I would say so, because they had a bad reputation. They'd had a bad name. They originally were very confrontational towards Paul. They had allowed sin to creep into the church, a lot of false teaching going on. So Titus, I think, probably was a little intimidated by going to this church to begin with, or uneasy about it, let me put it that way. But the bottom line was, should he have believed Paul? I think he found out he should have. And that's why he says, "His affection abounds all the more towards you, as he remembers the obedience of you all, how you received him with fear and trembling." So again, it shows you a complete difference. Remember, originally, they met Paul with confrontation. And now that Timothy has gone, now that Titus has gone there, Titus is saying his affection abounds all the more towards you. In other words, he loves you guys even more because he remembers the obedience, the change that you had made, and how you received him with fear and trembling. So again, that's a totally different church than what it originally was. And that gave Paul something. It gave him great confidence. And that's why he says, "I rejoice that in everything I have confidence in you." So he's saying, I'm full of joy because I am confident that you all, this church is on fire, it's on the right path, and it's exciting for me to hear that because I don't have to worry about it anymore. I have full confidence in it. Which brings about a question, how does it bring joy when you have confidence that loved ones are following God? Oh yes, whenever your loved ones are doing what's right, they're following God, they're in church, they're doing the right things, it brings great joy to you. And that's what joy that not only Paul was experiencing, also others as they were going to this church and seeing that great change, just like Titus was seeing. It brought great joy to the entire church body, I think, to know, hey, we don't have to, we continue. I'm sure they're going to continue to pray for this church and fellowship with this church, but there's no more of this concern of this church falling away, and that brings them great joy. Another thing to be aware of is when Paul wrote this letter, this second letter, there was a series of droughts that brought severe famine in Jerusalem and areas of the Middle East. So churches in that region were suffering because of lack of food and going hungry and lack of supplies and nourishment. However, the churches in the Macedonian cities, such as Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, were blessed with rain and were not suffering the severe drought that had hit the Middle East. And because of this, the churches in this area wanted to send financial support to the churches back in Jerusalem. And during this time, for many of the churches, the Corinthian Christians has never supported any of the ministry outside of Corinth. So that's something else that Paul's getting ready to address on. That's why I'm bringing it up. The Corinthians hadn't really been involved in what I would call missionary work, supporting other churches. And Paul's going to kind of bring that up. Here's the kind of the two regions. Corinth was in that big circle area there, and that was the region in Macedonia where they had plenty of food and plenty of water, no drought. Down in the right-hand corner is where Jerusalem's at. That's where they were having this severe drought. So what happened, people from all over the world had become Christians and were staying in Jerusalem. The believers sold everything they owned and distributed the cash among everyone in need in the church. However, eventually that money ran out. Christians could not get a job also because if you were a craftsman, such as a woodworker or store owner, it was expected of you to belong to a guild, and those guilds worshiped the false god of whatever their craft may be, and they were required to buy and sell idols of these gods. So that's another reason there was hunger and things going on. So that's what Paul's going to address next. He says, "Now, brothers and sisters, we have made known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia." What is the grace of God? Yeah, exactly. It's the mercy. It's how he has blessed us with. And Ephesians 2:8-9, we get the more detail of what the grace of God is. It's a free gift of God. Salvation is the best example of the grace of God. It says, God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it. So again, grace it's an unmerited favor. It's something we didn't earn. It's a gift from God. And it can mean salvation is obviously the best example of God's grace. What he has blessed us with, the house he's given us, the ability to support ourselves, all of those are examples of God's grace. And that's why he's saying, brothers and sisters, we've made known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia. Paul is referring to that they've not had the drought. They've got plenty of food. They're not going hungry. So God has blessed them with his grace by providing for them in that region, while the region of Jerusalem was suffering. That's why he said they are being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor, but they're also filled with abundant joy, which has overflowed in rich generosity. So he's talking about the churches in that region. They've been giving back, and he's trying to set the example for the church in Corinth. You also need to give back. He says other churches in this region, they've had troubles as far as persecution and things like that, and they don't have very much money, but they're filled with joy, and that has overflowed in rich generosity. Which brings up a good question. How can they be poor, yet be full of joy and overflowing in generosity? Right, they might not have money, but if they've got some extra food, they can share that. They've got their faith, they can share that. They have their riches are where we should be putting our riches, which is in eternity and not in the temporary, what we see here in this world. And it brings up another question. I found this interesting. Who has the tendency to be more generous, the rich or the poor? The poor, that's absolutely right. Why is that, do you think?
They understand because a lot of times they're in need.
Right, I think that's absolutely right. They understand what it is to need help. And Research, and they've done research on that, and research indicates that while the wealthy donate larger sums of money in total, because obviously they have more money, when you look at the percentage, the poor are more generous on a percentage of income basis. They give of greater proportions of what they have to others. Studies suggest this is because lower income individuals often feel more connected to others' needs and are more other focused than wealthier individuals who may feel a greater sense of entitlement or focus more on their own well-being. That's what the study had found. But it's clear, it's very interesting that it tends to be the poor people tend to be more generous than the wealthy.
They're more gracious.
Yeah, they
have, like you said, been without.
Uh-huh.
So they are more gracious of what they have. So where you're wealthy, doesn't seem much to them because they haven't really had to earn anything.
Right.
So a lot of them have been given wealth or
Yeah.
married into wealth or born into it. But or even with self-made man, can be wealthy. But when you have to do without and someone gives to you, you appreciate it. So they do. They appreciate what they have.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I love the way Paul looks at that. Paul isn't looking at how much they give. He's looking at the heart of the giver. And that's what he's saying about these churches in Macedonia. He says, "For I testify that according to their ability, and even beyond their ability, they gave voluntarily." So what kind of heart does those churches in Macedonia have? Gracious heart, a giving heart, a thankful heart. Yeah, they don't have anything, but they're wanting to give, even though they don't have anything to give. They're wanting to give as much as they can possibly give. It shows you a heart that is grateful and is not self-centered. And even he takes it a step further as Paul writes this. He says, they even begged us again and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift for the believers in Jerusalem. So again, churches are giving money to Jerusalem who's in need. There are churches in this region, he's talking about Macedonia, which are very poor. They have no money. And I don't think he's really even expecting them to give. So when you read what he's saying here, it sounds like he had told these churches, don't worry about giving. And they're like, no. They're begging him, please let us give. Let us take part in this privilege of sharing in the gift. The bottom line is giving about the money, how much money you give. No, it's all about the heart. And Jesus gave the perfect example of this. He actually used some of the disciples to show this, for this example. In John 6, verses 4 through 9, it says, "It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, 'Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?'" Jesus he's testing him here, but he's kind of setting him up. So they got this huge crowd. They're all hungry. And Jesus turns to Philip and says, "Where can we buy enough bread to feed all these people?" Do you think Jesus is concerned about the money? No, he's not. What about Philip? You think Philip's concerned about the money? Yes, Philip. And it even tells us here he was testing him. It says Jesus was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. So Jesus knew what he was going to do, but he's just using Philip here as an example. So he goes to Philip and says, "Where are we going to get enough money to feed all these people? Or how are we going to get enough food to feed all these people?" Philip's response should have been, "Well, you're God, you can make the food." But instead, he was testing Philip. And what do you think Philip was concerned about whenever he thought of all those people and he needed food? What came to his mind? Exactly. Yeah, those disciples weren't rich. They didn't have much money. So Philip replied, here's his reply to Jesus, "Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them." So again, it shows you they were very poor. They didn't have a lot of money. And when Jesus says, how are we going to feed all these people? The first thing Philip thought about was, how are we going to pay to feed all these people? I don't have any money. None of the other disciples have any money. And even if we worked for months, we couldn't come up with the money to feed them. So did Philip pass the test? No. So Jesus was testing him, and obviously he didn't pass the test. Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what is good is that with this huge crowd? What about Andrew? Did Andrew pass the test? No. What were Andrew and Philip focused on?
Not enough.
Not enough. On the temporary, on the material things. They forgot they were with God. they were so they were focused on the material things. And again, what did Jesus do to prove his point? He showed them where you should have your mind at and not worry about stuff in this world. So what he did says, Jesus says, tell everyone to sit down. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered 5,000. So imagine that. Remember, this is years ago. They didn't have seats or stadiums or things like that. They were just sitting on a hillside. If there are 5,000 men, good chance there are 5,000 women. No telling how many kids. So you're looking at least 10,000 people. Could you imagine 10,000 people sitting out? You know, it would just fill this whole pasture area up. It'd just be full of people.
Well, if you had the money,
Uh-huh.
you still probably wouldn't have the bread.
Right. You'd have to make a lot of bread. You're right. Yeah, they didn't have the ability to mass manufacture stuff like we have today. So then Jesus took the loaves, and notice what he did. He gave thanks to God and then distributed them to the people. Afterwards, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told the disciples, now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. I find it interesting. How many disciples does he have with him? 12. Each of them got a basket to take home with them. So Jesus even sent them a reminder home with them of that he is God and not to worry about the money. Because the bottom line is, and this is the point I think Paul's making here when he's talking about the generosity of these churches, is giving isn't about the heart. Giving is about the heart. It's not about the amount. If you give generously with a cheerful and gracious heart, God will take care of the rest. If all you have is a few fish and a few loaves of bread, it's amazing what God can do with that. If all you got is 10 cents in your pocket and you give it to God, it's amazing what he can do with that.
That's kind of like the ones that, it's always in the big churches they do a lot, where the ones that's got money will give it for a status or some status symbol. And my whole statement the whole time me and Pam would sit there and I'm like, yeah, but they're probably not giving it from the heart.
Right.
They're giving it for a reason, personal reason. So they're not going to get returned.
Right. And that's exactly, Joe, that is exactly what Jesus described in Luke 21, verses 1 through 4. It says, while Jesus was in the temple, he watched the rich people dropping their gifts in the collection box when a poor woman came by and dropped in 2 small coins. Who do you think the people would say had a greater giving heart? That woman that just gave 2 small coins, or the people that were throwing all the money in there?
2 small coins could have been it.
Yeah. But the world, as the world looking at it, who does the world view as the one that's the greater giver? Obviously the one that's throwing all the money, and they're the one that has all the money they're giving to the church. But it's, in God's eyes, it's not about the amount, it's about the heart. Again, God looked at it much different than what people does, and that's why God says, I tell you the truth, Jesus said. This poor widow has given more than all the rest of them put together, is what he's saying. For they've only given a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she has. So which one did Jesus says was the one that gave the most? Yeah, the lady that only had 2 little pennies. That's all she had to put in there. And that's what I think of whenever he's describing these churches in Macedonia for begging them. Because it says, they begged us and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift of the believers in Jerusalem. See, to them, to give to others, to help others was a privilege. It wasn't something that was that they were forced to do. It was something they wanted to do as a privilege. They got joy out of helping others. And then he continues, and this, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. What does Paul mean when he said they first gave themselves to the Lord? Do you think? They had their hearts right. Their heart was right with God. They were giving, they were faithfully tithing. Their heart was right with God, and they gave to God first, and then they gave what they had left over to help support these other churches. And how does someone devoted to the Lord view their money?
It's not their money.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's not ours. God has given, it all belongs to the Lord. He's given us great blessings to be able to take care of ourselves, to feed ourselves, to gives us homes to live in. But it's all God's. It's none of it's ours. We couldn't be where we're at if God didn't allow it to happen. So it all belongs to God. I love Winston Churchill. He made a statement once, and I think that's it hits home to kind of what I think the message that Paul's giving us here. He says, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." And again, it's all about the heart. Matthew 6, verses 25 through 33, we see sort of a similar message to what Jesus was teaching the disciples on that hillside when he had all those people in need of food, and they were worried about where they were going to get the money to pay for it. Jesus says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" I underline that because I think that's an interesting statement. I know we've heard that before, but when you think about it, there's so much truth in that. We tend to worry about things we have absolutely no control over. We worry about things that there's just nothing we can do about it other than just turn it over to the Lord. And just by worrying about it, worrying is not going to accomplish anything other than shorten your life, not add to your life. And that's the point he's making here. He says, "And why do you worry about your clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these." If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, "What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear?" For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Now, the pagans, that's those that don't know God. The world is chasing after all of those. And we as Christians, we have nothing to worry about. The Creator is our Father. And that's why he says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." I think that's the message that he was teaching his disciples when he tested them on that hillside with feeding all those people. That's a message to us today, to not worry about things. God is in control. We need to worry about our relationship with God. And I don't like to say the word worry. We need to make sure we have a strong relationship with God, and we don't have to worry about anything else. And I think that's what those churches in Macedonia, that's the heart that they had, because it says they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then they wanted to give to them, to these churches in Jerusalem. So it says, "So we urge Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well." So again, Titus was sent there, and he's encouraging Titus. It says that he's already beginning a great work in you. And in other words, the church, what he's saying is, you guys have done a complete 180. Now I'm going to talk about something else that you guys can grow in and build on, and that is giving graciously and gracious giving. And that's why he says, "But just as you excel in everything," and again, he's complimenting this church, and he's proud of this church for the way they have changed. He doesn't worry about this church. He's not concerned about this church having false doctrine creep in anymore. So he's trying to now get them to grow. And he says, "You've excelled in your faith, in your speaking, in your knowledge and in all earnestness, and in the love we inspired you, seek that you also excel in this gracious work. Now, what gracious work is Paul talking about there? He's asking the church to excel in. Yeah, giving, to be a giving church, supporting the missions, giving to other churches, being a giving church. And how is giving gracious work?
How does it work?
Mm-hmm. How is giving gracious work?
Your church grows. Your church grows in numbers. God fills the church with people.
Exactly.
When you actually giving graciously, you're going to grow. I don't know how else to say. You'll grow, and not just in numbers, but in spiritually also with God's grace. So you work for Him, He supplies the rest.
Absolutely, that's what he's telling them. He's talking about what the church should be doing, and he says you're strong in your faith, which means that you have a strong relationship with God. You're firm in your speaking, which means you're teaching and preaching the truth. You're excelling in your knowledge. That's biblical knowledge. You know the Word. You're not letting the world creep into it, and you loving others. Now, here's another form of work that you can do that's just as gracious, which is giving. And then he says something interesting. He says, I am not saying this as a command, but as proving through the earnestness of others the sincerity of your love as well. So why is he saying it's not? Why is he saying giving is not a command?
It should be a will.
Right.
You should want to do it.
Right. Absolutely correct, Joe. And that's what the point he's making there is that when it comes to giving, no one should twist your arm and say you must give. No one must say you have to give this amount of money, you must give this amount, because it's about the heart, not the requirement. And that's why he's saying, no, I'm not commanding you to give, but understand your giving proves something. It proves the sincerity of your love. It proves that you truly care about these other churches. It proves your love for them. And it's not, if I were to command you to give, then that takes all of that away.
Sincerity away.
Yeah, it takes the sincerity away. It then becomes a tax or a required payment. And he's saying, no, it's not about me requiring you to give. I want you to learn how you should, just like the other church he was talking about, want to give and not be forced to give, I guess is what he's saying. So anyway, again, that's amazing how this church has turned around, and now Paul is actually getting them to even grow more as a church and teaching them about what it is to be giving and have a giving heart. So with that said, we are out of time. Joe, do you want to close this in prayer?